What you're about to experience is one man's quest to see beyond the tumultuous period we're in and to envision what lies just beyond our grasp, yet well within our reach. Welcome to Larry Rifkin's America Trends, where the future has arrived, and it's just in time.
Welcome back to another episode of America Trends Podcast. I'm Larry Rifkin. John Kropsick's got the headphones on, and he's all pumped up today. Hey, John, you remember that song by John Lennon? And it was a good song, but it's not one like Imagine, but it's Power to the People.
I do remember that.
Power to the people.
Didn't you used to sing that to Nick?
Who?
You sang that to Nick all the time.
Oh, yeah. We used to have a listener who was a real expert because he had climbed those wires. He was a lineman for the county, except we did away with counties, and that did away with him. But do you think by any chance he was talking about this grid, John Lennon, or was he even thinking about wires and transformers, or no?
Probably not, because who thinks about the grid? You really think about it.
No, we don't.
You turn on the switches and everything works, and
until
most
it doesn't.
Of the time, until it doesn't.
And then when it doesn't,
you freeze your butt off for a week.
You got buildings that go dark. You got street lights that go off. You have computers and smartphones that die and disconnect you from the world that you've built online. And there's no TV. Imagine, sounds like the beginning of a really bad Stephen King short story, doesn't it?
It does.
It really does. But we want to avoid all these things. But how does the grid really work? I mean, do we really understand it?
No. What is the grid?
Well, you're an electrical engineer. John, come on. I mean, you're a guy who knows a lot about how these currents all work, AC, DC.
That's true.
You even went to a concert of theirs.
That's true.
AC/DC.
ACD, yes. Yeah.
No, but seriously, I mean, how does all this really come together? Do you think it's like one big grid all across the country?
No, it's all different grids for different parts of the country. That's why a squirrel in Ohio can knock out the power for all of the Northeast here and not anywhere else. So,
well, it's funny. There are some curious things that we learn as part of this podcast with Gretchen Bakke. And Gretchen's going to be along in just a minute. She wrote the book called The Grid, The Fraying Wires Between Americans and Our Energy Future. And I learned a lot talking with her. I mean, I thought she was absolutely fascinating. But much of the debate, of course, of late has been about reliability and about cyber attacks and so forth. When she tells you what the greatest threat is, you're going to be startled. And I don't want to give it away. I really don't. No.
Okay.
But that's really, I mean, you're not going to believe this.
And I probably won't believe it.
Well, you got to believe it because she's good. I mean, this woman knows her stuff. But, we've also been talking lately about whether we're going to have clean coal as a source to get it onto the grid. She answers that question pretty definitively, doesn't she, John?
I think she did, yes.
And, of course, natural gas, everybody talks about that. Is that really the future or just something that we're using in transition? And then if you're curious, as we were, John and I, about renewables and whether, in fact, this is just a fad or whether we're really moving inexorably in that direction, I think she's pretty conclusive in the way we're going on that, too.
It seems like we're moving more towards solar and wind, but...
Now, you've been thinking about that for your own house.
I have been thinking about that.
Now,
yes.
What's the drawback for you?
Well, I don't like the long-term contract they put you on. I think it's a lot of money and they lock you in. So, it's kind of scary.
Kind of scary, yeah. So you haven't done it. I mean, you've been talking about it. You've been thinking about it.
I've been looking at the different companies, but I haven't. I have yet to actually sign anything or do anything because. Like I said, it's a lot of money to you tie up your all this money for all these years, and if you want to sell now, the people got to
they've got to want it.
They got to want it, right? Or if they don't, then it works against you. So.
But have you thought perhaps about selling that energy back to the power companies, because one of the things we talked to her about is this model, this business model that Con Ed and Eversource and all of these companies have, and whether that is under threat these days. But have you thought about it if you did generate solar power, like the notion of selling it back?
Well, that's the way it works right now. You basically buy it, and what you don't use goes back on the line. So, I mean, that's the system we have, because we haven't really, we don't really have a storage that's really.
You mean you put putting it in a shed in the backyard?
Exactly.
Or putting it in the attic? Or, well, no, it's interesting because that's a big issue that we raised with Gretchen about batteries and storage and so forth. And that seems like unlocking the Holy Grail once we get to that.
Once we unlock that, we can make the electric companies obsolete.
The Electric Company. I used to love that show.
Yeah, that was a good show.
On PBS. Remember that Morgan Freeman, he got one of his big starts on The Electric Company. Well, why don't we make some room here on America Trends Podcast for one Gretchen Bakke,
yes,
who wrote a book called The Grid, The Fraying Wires Between Americans and Our Energy Future. Let's welcome Gretchen. Gretchen, let me ask you, you came to all of this without really a scientific background. What was it that you had to school yourself in to really understand the inner workings of the grid?
It's actually a great question, because the thing that anthropologists do normally is they go somewhere where they don't speak the language, and they don't really understand what's going on, and then they just spend time. The rule is 4 seasons, so you can spend a year or you can spend 4 summers, just kind of learning, listening, learning to speak, to understand everything from how to eat, how to sit around a table, how to raise children, how to talk about things, et cetera, et cetera. And so I essentially did that. It took me 3 years of just talking to people in industry and slowly, very slowly, through asking a lot of questions, just figuring out what things meant, how things worked. And then the real task was, once I had a very basic grasp, I would say 3 years to get a basic grasp, beginning to try to think about how to translate the technical knowledge that I understood into a language I would have understood 3 years before. So that's what the book does. Is it takes things which are very natural for electrical engineers or for people who've been in the industry for a long time, and it makes them really clearly understandable to anybody. That was the baseline that I was wondering about. What did you assume your readers understood about turning on a light and all of a sudden this whole world of wonder comes alive? So you assume we knew nothing. Yeah, I assumed that people knew nothing because that's what I knew. And there's been beautiful moments where I'll be talking to somebody and they'll just stand up and turn the light off, and they'll say, and everybody will go, oh, So it also brings this kind of very strong awareness of how much electricity there is, actually just running all the stuff that's around us all of the time. So it's not just like, okay, what is voltage? How does it work? But it's sort of our whole world when you slow down and look at it. Oh, absolutely. We only know that when we are without it for a certain period of time. But the question that I would start with for people who really don't know a lot about the grid, but we've heard a lot about it, its vulnerabilities and the like, but who runs and who owns the grid? And what is the grid? Yeah, so 3 very different questions. Yeah. The grid is a system for making electricity, for transiting electricity, so what we usually think of as wires, and then for using electricity. And in some cases, even storing it. And we can talk about storage later. There's not much of it. And so a grid can be tiny, or it can be the size of half of a continent, which is what we have in the U.S. We have one for the West, one for the East, and then Texas has their own. And it's all, so if you think of the Western grid, for example, it's all of the generation, so power stations on that half continent, which also includes the western part of Canada. So every coal-burning plant, every big hydroelectric dam, every wind farm, every solar panel, all of those things making electricity are part of the grid. Then all the wires, which we're pretty used to thinking of. When you say the grid, people usually imagine the wires, these long-distance wires, transmission. The shorter wires, lower voltage wires we have in our neighborhoods, which are called distribution. But then it's also all the machines. So we tend not to think about it this way, but the grid isn't made for us because electricity will kill us. So it's really this system that is side by side with us that's designed to make our machines run. And so if you look at your stove, if it's an electric stove, that's part of the grid. If you look at your cell phone, that's part of the grid, the whole thing. And it's instantaneous, essentially. So that electricity is made and it's used within about a second.
And that is a really key point that we want to get to when we begin to talk about the future and alternatives. But let's go back to the various things that you say comprise the grid. What's the most vulnerable of all of those elements today as you look at it?
Vulnerable? It's a hard question. I think because the biggest threat to our grid right now is trees, foliage of various sorts, to a lesser degree squirrels and other kinds of wildlife.
Now, wait a minute, Gretchen, somebody's listening to this, and they thought it was going to be ISIS or Al-Qaeda or climate change, and you're telling us what?
Trees.
Trees.
Mm-hmm.
Beautiful trees.
They grow.
Yes, they do.
And there's a lot of them in America. We have a lot of trees. It's really
We're in one of the most forested parts of the entire country, and I know they've been chopping them down after some of the calamitous events that we had a couple of years back when we were all without power for 6 or 7 days. So tell us how all of this really impinges upon the system.
Well, I mean, it's really, in a way, it makes the system more robust, I guess you could say, because one of the things that's happened as over the last century, as we've become more and more dependent on electricity, but also better and better at making the grid work, is that there's a lot of duplicate lines. And that's because you can't control all the trees. There's all of this tree trimming that's going on. There's all of this, like people go out with herbicides and try to kill the kudzu, and back it comes, right? So there is a kind of way in which we tackle the trees, but we can never defeat the trees. And we don't want to cut them all down, obviously. We like having the trees. And in some ways, that lesson can also apply to terrorists, which is it's hard to get rid of them all, right? So how do you deal with with controlling them or minimizing the impact that they can have on an infrastructural system like the grid? It's not so dissimilar in this kind of like dangerous and uncountable and sort of unknowable way.
When we think about the business of the grid, going back to that, the natural monopoly, that whole notion in this field, exclusivity in exchange for tight regulation. Explain how that developed.
Well, what the natural monopoly means, I think, for everyday people is that you don't get to choose who you buy your electricity from. So if you live in PEPCO territory, you pay a bill to PEPCO, and it's not that you can say, like, oh, I don't really like that company, I'm going to go to this other company, and buy my electricity from them. There are places now where the monopoly structure is breaking down because of deregulation and various sorts of restructuring, but throughout the 20th century, that was the way that the grid was designed or sort of came to be, I guess, and the reason for that is that it was thought, it wasn't true, but it was thought that electricity was the kind of commodity that the more competition you had, the more it would cost. So there's the commonsensical sense of competition is that if 5 people make a widget and they're all competing on the open market, they'll start to make their widgets cheaper in order to attract customers. And with electricity, what was happening, because it's so expensive to build a generating station, so expensive to put in lines, there's this initial outlay of money just to make something like a grid, that it was always going to be more expensive if there was competition. And this wasn't how it started in the late 1800s, but by the 19-teens, this was just common. It was common sense that it would be what we now call natural monopolies, and that held true up until the late 1970s. And then there started to be these sort of cultural shifts in part that became legislative shifts that allowed it, that made it clear that in fact you could make electricity more cheaply than the utilities were at that time making it. And that kind of just shook the grounds of the idea of the grid. And that's part of what the book is about.
Oh, absolutely.
It's not just explaining this big technological thing, but that the form and the functioning of this big technological thing has actually shifted radically as America changes over time, over a century and a half, essentially, is how long we've had it.
You suggest that we've always wanted to have more control over that which juices our appliances and the like, and yet we did rest on this big, centralized, vast current system, and the term current is not meant to be a pun, but now we're looking towards something that's a lot more flexible, more adaptive. How does this clash play out?
Well, the shift has actually been kind of accidental, and I think that that's part of what's made it so jarring, which is that this idea that, for example, a company can make electricity for more cheaply than a utility can. One of the things that it opened up a lot of electricity production by essentially big hot factories. So they were making a lot of heat anyway, and they called cogeneration plants, and so they would just sort of make electricity on the side. So that was one thing that really started to happen in the early 1980s. But the other thing that started to happen is renewables. And renewables, they make, not all of them, but wind and solar, sort of our most favorite ones, they make electricity in a very different way than a coal-fired plant or a gas plant or a nuclear power plant or even a hydroelectric dam. And that is that wind turbine, you can guess this by watching it, but a wind turbine, it makes electricity when the wind is blowing, and it makes more when it's blowing hard, and it makes less when it's blowing less hard. And a solar panel is the same thing. When it's cloudy, it makes less. At night, it makes none. But even if there's like a puffy white cloud, like you have Phoenix, just sort of coated in solar panels now, and a little puffy white cloud goes over, and you can see as it passes each of these solar panels, there's a little dip in how much electricity is coming out of those panels. And because all of this electricity is going into the grid, and it's all being used up essentially within the second, and because we don't really have a good way to store electricity, this variability started to, as more and more of it began to be fed into the grid, it started to demand different ways of managing.
So is that the reason that this marvel of the 20th century really is not terribly well suited to where we're headed?
Yeah, absolutely. And also, I mean, there's a lot of reasons. But one is that the natural monopoly was proven not to be true. That opened the door then for these renewables, which are then forcing change upon the system. But then there's also the internet, which has allowed a much sort of more real-time trading on energy markets, basically near-term and one day ahead electricity markets, and that has changed the financing of how people make money on electricity, essentially by making those processes electric, so that the information about electricity is moving at the same speed that electricity is moving, and that's quite different than it ever was in the 20th century. So all of these things are changing everything in our life.
So the whole business model,
smart meters, like all of these things are shifting, and they're also shifting for the grid.
So the whole business model is somewhat coming apart, and then some of these sources that we now are utilizing as the source material for this electricity, it does not conform terribly well to the way the grid has to use things in real time.
Right, and it works relatively well if you're 3%, 5%, 10%, 12%. You get up to 30-35% variable, and things just need to be managed differently. It's not, for a while people said like 25-30% renewables was the highest we could get without just completely redoing the grid. But in fact, you can get up to about 35%, but then the imagination has to change. And the way that we use, the way that we conserve, what is automated and what is not automated on the use side of things starts to have to change, because the great trick of electricity is that everything always has to be in balance. And so if you have a dishwasher that can turn on when there's a lot of wind, as opposed to turning on when you want to wash your dishes, that becomes a critical part of sort of a 21st century idea of what a grid can be and how it can work, that kind of automation.
Explain to us, for example, what happens in terms of the signaling to all of these wind farms when there's a gust that's going across the plains, and yet they can't really hold on to that for any period of time. The chain of events that are required to modulate that.
Yeah, so the turbines have gotten better and better for that, but I think the great sorrow is that you have this giant gust of wind, and it's hitting these wind. Let's say Iowa. Iowa is regularly making more than 30% of the electricity it uses per day from wind. So you have this giant gust of wind. It's going to hit Iowa. Everything starts to spin around like crazy. And Iowa is desperately trying to get that electricity anywhere that'll use it. So they're trying to run stuff up to the Twin Cities. There's not enough people in Iowa, right, for all that electricity. They need to have enough line space because if there's too much power, it will actually cause the lines to short out. So there's also a capital investment to these wind farms of sort of long distance lines to get the electricity to urban centers or factories or wherever. And what should happen is that there should be some way to use all the electricity when it's there. But what happens, in fact, is that lots of people call up the guys managing the wind farm and say, could you shut down your turbines because it's too much electricity for us right now? And then the wind farm guys say, because they're private, it used to be that the utilities were vertically integrated, which meant generation was owned by the utility, but that is no longer the case in most places. So they're a private company, and they make money when they're producing electrons.
So the suppliers now and the distributors
so they say, no, why
have
would
been
we do
separated.
That? Yeah, exactly. They would say, why would we do that? That's no good for us. We're making a lot of money right now, and if we turn our stuff down, then we stop getting our subsidies. We don't make any money on what we have. So now what's happened is that you can turn down a wind turbine, which was even 10 years ago not that common. So they can produce less electricity than they would normally in a big gust of wind. They can shift that at the production side. But there is this sort of nagging sorrow, I think, it's the same feeling you have when you drive by a house with solar panels on the roof. They've got this big roof, and there's two panels. You know, and you're like, you have a whole south-facing roof. Why do you only if we're having a renewables revolution? What is that? You know, and that's the same thing with the wind turbines. It's like we can make all this electricity, but we're just not set up right now to actually use it.
Well, we will talk about storage and batteries and the like, but this is a wonderful conversation. The grid, the fraying wires between Americans and our energy future, and this is Gretchen Bakke. She's a PhD, but she deals more with anthropology, but she really has gotten into the life of the grid and electricity and how it affects the way that we live. I want to go back to the person who's listening, and I would imagine that is most of the audience. And they only want to know that when I turn on the lights or my computer or my refrigerator is going to stay at a certain even keel. Power outages here in the United States, are we still at a level that I had read 99.7% in terms of dependability 24/7 on?
So last year was actually particularly good for power outages, but we've been among the worst in the developed world for the last 15 years or so, to the degree that the U.S. used to keep an aggregate statistic of outages. So if you look up Japan, for example, you see that they had, 6 outage minutes a year before the tsunami. And then you look up the U.S., there's no information on that anymore. And it's because the number had gotten so big that they just stopped doing it. So we don't know. We actually don't. It is not known what the outage minutes are. But the big issue in the U.S., besides the trees, is that a lot of our outages are quite short, and those can be very damaging to machinery. So what we remember are the big ones, where like all of the Northeast is blacked out, or there's a hurricane, and Hurricane Irene, for example, that just took down so many lines, and there was somebody in Arizona at one point a lineman who set a switch in the wrong way and then blacked out the Southeast for a while.
What about the one in Ohio in 2003?
Yeah, or that's the big East Coast blackout that was in fact caused by trees and a computer bug. So we remember those because it's like some people get stuck in elevators. That big 2003 blackout, there was like a bump in babies 9 months later. Like that becomes this kind of memorable event. But actually, it's the little ones that are really hard to deal with. And you have all of these companies now who are primarily digital, and they need to have. And when I say that, I mean like prisons with electric locks as much as Google, right? So there's different ways of being a highly digitized or a highly electricity-dependent organization or company. And those kinds of institutions, they can't lose power. And they can't have. They need to have a very, very high quality power, which means that the voltage isn't varying very much. Mm-hmm. And both of those things are hard to maintain on a really, really big system, and they're really hard to maintain when you're getting a lot of variable generation coming into that system.
Well, when you have a system that is in such flux as ours seems to be, based upon what you're telling us, the Energy Department in the United States, now under Rick Perry, back in the early part of 2016, they had this ambitious multi-year plan for the grid. Tell us what they were looking at and how much anybody's thinking about the grid, given how diffused it is.
Yeah, so people don't really think about the grid. I can tell you this, having written a book about it, that it's not a part of our consciousness in just sort of everyday American life. It's something that's there. It's like flushing your toilet, turning on your light. It's these systems, these infrastructural systems, which are quite complicated, difficult to build, reasonably difficult to maintain, but which we really take for granted. That said, Texas is a surprising place. And Rick Perry, being from Texas, will be a surprising, I think, head of the Secretary of Energy, because Texas has the most installed wind power in the U.S. by far, far more than California. It's got a lot of wind. It has so much wind that there are parts of Texas that at 9 p.m. the electricity is free.
Explain that. I read that.
So, Texas wind blows most strongly at night. Mm-hmm. And so, because, again, they have this problem of the problem is excess. The 20th century problem was somehow shortage. How are we going to get the oil, to put in our cars? How are we going to get the coal to put in our power plants? But now with the renewables, the problem is often excess. And so there's so much wind blowing across Texas at night that there are pieces of Texas where the electricity is free. For a while, they would actually pay you. The price would go negative. They would pay you to use electricity.
And Gretchen, you would think, talk about cultural influences, that in Texas, that industry would have had a hard time getting off the ground given all the fossil fuel and oil interests.
Yeah, that's what you would think. But what's been interesting about the transition to renewables is that places that had a very strong energy consciousness in terms of their economy before are often 3 or 4 steps ahead in terms of renewables. So you have a lot in Ohio, coal country. You have a lot in Texas, oil country. California is a special case, but even Saudi Arabia, not in the U.S. obviously, but they're doing some very, very innovative things with solar power. And so there's something about this idea, like somebody knows how to run an oil company. Well, they kind of also know how to run a renewable power company. So there's a skill set that just sort of moves forward. They can see. I don't remember the number, but it's been a long time since Texas oil was going up. So they've known for a long time that they needed to diversify the economy, but they're good at energy. And they have a lot of wind, and they have a lot of sun.
When you hear the debate about whether green projects are really a waste of money, Solyndra obviously was one of those examples. What do you say? And when you hear people saying, let's go back and clean up the coal, when you're talking about all the excess capacity that yet we can't harness it for the moment, but ultimately I think we'll figure that out, what do you say to that argument?
Well, coal is done. This is kind of no. Even though Donald Trump really campaigned on a sort of we'll bring coal back, even coal country knows that coal is done. And now there are 4 times as many people in the U.S. employed in the solar sector than there are in the coal sector. So it's more of a question from a working point of view, how to make sure that there's good, solid jobs at all levels of the economy in the renewables industry. So we're not just importing everything. Because that's, there's no reason that people need to be employed in coal mines. They can be employed in making solar panels.
And what is the portfolio of renewables that you consider to be really the future here in America?
So the future is actually all about diversification. So what it will probably, there's different visions sort of for the East and the West, interestingly, but we can say that probably what will happen is that there will be sort of a set of resources which will work together. So those resources will probably include hydroelectric power, wind power, solar power, often radically distributed, which means that there will be some centralized solar plants, but like solar on everybody's house. Some kind of battery storage, probably also radically distributed. So you would have a little Tesla power pack in your garage, for example, not for charging your car, but that you are basically keeping for the utility. So if you have solar panels on your roof, you can store some of that in your battery, but you're also making that battery available to your utility to store their excess electricity and also to take electricity from when they need it. So you'll have those. You have a resource that people never think about, which is the lines. If you, for example, have a ton of wind someplace and you have a factory that says, hey, I'm happy to turn on whenever that wind is running, whenever the wind is blowing hard, you still need to have the line available at that moment to move all of that power. So that's a resource that has to kind of be integrated into the story. There's dispatchable conservation, which, again, people don't think about that much. But that's what I was saying, like if you have a dishwasher that knows when to turn on because there's a lot of electricity available, you can use that electricity at that time, but you can also have, for example, a big building that will just sort of slightly dim its lights when there's a lack of electricity so that nobody even notices that. And so that's called dispatchable conservation, which is all of this kind of integrated intelligence into the built environment around us that is reacting to the variability of the electrical supply.
And we began on this podcast to talk about the smart home, and this would all be integrated into that.
Absolutely.
When is this storage issue, the battery issue, when is this going to be resolved? I mean, are we 10 years away, 20 years? Elon Musk and others are working on this.
Yeah, so that's the golden cow. No, I don't know what's the right word. The golden egg, the holy grail. So people, you say battery, and you can like hear these like little angels making angel noises in the background, right? Like, there's the battery. There are a lot of possible ways to kind of guard the capacity of electricity made now for later use. So, and the battery is one of them. And I can talk a lot about batteries, but I want to also point to the boring ones because people are so excited about batteries, which is smart hot water heaters, for example. They can heat up hot water when there's too much electricity, and then they don't have to heat up hot water later. So when you take a shower, instead of it heating up right after you've had a shower, it heats up quite hot. Say at noon, if you live in Phoenix, it heats up quite hot at noon when there's a lot of solar power on the grid. And then that hot water is there. That's a kind of electricity storage, thermal storage. We also have pumped hydro, and there's a lot of sort of versions of that. But you use excess electricity to pump water up a hill, store it in a reservoir that would normally be empty, and then when you need electricity, you let it run downhill from gravity. So that's a mechanical way of storing electricity, and then the battery is then a chemical way of storing electricity. So probably, despite this sort of like angel noise when people talk about batteries, probably what will end up happening is that there will, again, be a mix of these different kinds of storage capacities at different scales. So like small batteries in people's houses, maybe a few big batteries on the grid. We have that happening now in California because of this Alito Canyon gas facility leak. California basically said, we have to check for leaks on the whole system before we can use the system, and they're almost all natural gas right now. And so a bunch of I think there's 3 giant batteries that have come online in the last 2 months in California. So that's the test case to see how those work. But battery chemistry is tricky. every chemistry that you put in a battery is really good for something. But as soon as you start to, what they say in the industry, stack functionality, so as soon as you want a battery that can solve power quality. So if the voltage isn't quite staying right on the system, that you have a battery that can step in for that. That's one kind of chemistry is going to be really good for that. If you want to be able to provide a lot of electricity very fast, for example, if there's a cloud that's going over solar country, a different kind of chemistry is really good for that. If you want to provide 4 hours of backup for this period from when the sun goes down to when people go to sleep, which is the big problem for solar. Sun goes down, but we're still awake using electricity. So let's say you need this 3, 4, 5 hours of battery backup. That's a different kind of chemistry. So designing a battery system that can do all of these things that we need, that's a big trick. And so there's, of course, like a million smart people working on that right now. But it could be, we've had electricity for 150 years without really having any storage. So there's also a lot of smart people who are trying to figure out to, like, when we get batteries, that'll be great. But until then, what can we do? And I was talking to somebody at lunch a couple of days ago, and he waved toward the future. He said, when they solve that battery problem, we'll talk about it. But for now, between now and when that happens, there's a lot of it forces a kind of intense creativity for the people who are in the business to try to figure out how to almost follow. Every time someone puts a solar panel on their roof, it changes the dynamics of the grid, and that push is moving so quickly that a lot of the developers of lines, the people who are managing the grid, the people who are legislating the grid, regulating the grid, they're kind of following, for the first time ever, what you could call a market force.
But does that give us the opportunity then to erase some of the concerns that people have about the vulnerability? Because a lot of people think it's one grid. We know it's not one grid. But now there are people going off the grid. There are people with their own mini grids that are being built in communities. Is this making us more resilient?
Well, going off the grid is actually less common than one would think, by which I mean just a house that's totally independent. So it has a grid. It's just that it's making its electricity. It has its own wires, and it has its own machines that use those wires, and it doesn't ever touch the rest of the world. This is the reason that people don't really do this is it's insanely complicated, and you have all the problems of the big grid, but you have them on a small scale, and you have to manage them. So most people don't want to do that. It's just too much work, and it's a lot of machines, like a lot of gray machines and gray boxes.
All right, so this is a romanticized sense that I'm living my own world, and I don't have to interact with the rest of you.
I'm going to have a compound. Yeah, exactly. But what people are doing, less than we think, but it's definitely, there's a lot of people talking about doing it, and there's a lot of interest in it, especially in the area knocked out by Hurricane Sandy, is doing what's called a microgrid. And that's a small grid. It's more than 1 meter, so it's not a house. The definition is it has to have more than 1 meter, and it has to have more than one source of electricity. So it could be, a little nuclear power plant, and sort of a weird example, but so there is one that has but like a gas turbine and a solar panel, or a battery and a fuel cell, or something. There has to be sort of more than one way of making electricity in the system, and more than one way of drawing electricity down from it. And these are designed so that under times of stress, they can island themselves, and that means they can disconnect from the grid and continue to work. And that's a big source of resiliency, because it's not necessarily it's not providing electricity out to a community. Mostly these are on college campuses or hospitals. There are these kinds of single owner. The post office could do it, for example. These sort of single owner bases, companies, these kinds of things. But there is heat and light. There is food. There is a functioning hospital in a space which has been blacked out. And so the resiliency isn't so much about providing that power during a blackout to the community, but providing the resource where a community can come in and use get clean, eat a hot meal, charge their phones. All of these kinds of things are really necessary. And New Jersey Transit, for example, is thinking of building one that would allow people to get in and out of New York City on electric trains. It would use all the stations that would then become warming houses, and this would be a huge benefit for during a big outage like during Sandy, like during 2003.
Oh, absolutely. Gretchen, I would be remiss in the short time that we have not to reference the concerns about cyber attack and sabotage and how well protected these computer systems that are now running the grid. What would you say about that?
Well, there's going to be more and more of them, and they're not particularly well protected. Mm-hmm. So it's definitely an issue. So I tend to say, let's think about trees and squirrels because that's what's right in our face right now. But it is true that this is a hackable system. So people will hack it. I mean, somebody just hacked the fire sirens, the tornado alarms in Dallas. I don't know if you've heard about this, but they went off for an hour and a half. So if you can hack a tornado alarm system just as a joke, it's not just as easy to hack the grid, but it's not very hard. And there's, of course, a lot of talk about it, but we have 3,600 utilities over that in the U.S., and so getting anything, and some of them are for-profit, some of them are municipal nonprofit, some of them are co-ops. There's just all these different ways we run the utility system. So getting everybody on board for this sort of giant interlocking, complex electricity system, so that something as simple as a hack by somebody who's clever and sort of devoted to that task, to figuring out a way to block that it's a task. And right now, it's again, there are people working on it, but there isn't sort of a centralized, as rarely in the electricity business, there isn't a centralized sort of being on the top of a pyramid that's saying, here's how it will be.
Well, it's amazing when you describe all this to us that this all does come together. I mean,
and it mostly works.
Yeah, I mean, it does. Let me ask you this. In the book you write, and then I'll close with this, because a lot of people really can get tangible when it comes to this. You write, you know these. You likely pay a bill to one of them every month. They have names like Con Ed, National Grid, PG&E, Pepco, Xcel, Entergy, Southern Company. I know here in our area, Eversource. So how long are they going to be in business? How long will these be the names that we ultimately send our bills to every month?
They're really worried that it won't be as long, that it won't be forever. But the problem for the utilities is that they're still very highly regulated, and they're used to being highly regulated, and often they're obliged to do things that don't make any sense. And they're also massive companies. These ones that you've listed, they're massive companies. And so given that what's happening now is that things are getting smaller and they're getting more dynamic, and they're moving faster, and they interlock with each other in different kinds of ways, the utilities, not all of them, but many of them are sort of tripping over this process. And so will some of them go bankrupt? For sure. But they have learned or are attempting to learn from the telecom transition as well for how not to go bankrupt. For how to have a sort of a complete transformation of the business model and of what's supplied and how it's billed for, and to they are the masters of the lines. They know how those lines work. They upkeep those lines, so they're a valuable resource in that way. But they also have to learn to be a little lighter on their feet, and you see it. Hawaii, which can now at noon produce 250 times the amount of electricity they can use, just from rooftop solar on people's houses. They're doing some very, very interesting work. Green Mountain Power in Vermont, which also has a giant amount of solar, which one would not expect, but Vermonters, they like solar power. They're doing very interesting work. And then New York State, of course, has now obliged their utilities to make a long-term plan for a transition to renewables, which is almost entire. So it can be done. But again, there's a lot of utilities, and each one of them is working in a very, very different way to adapt to the situation. And they get some credit. I mean, people don't like their utility, or they're neutral toward their utility, but they get some credit for the fact that all of this has been happening at an increasing rate since 2008, and for the most part, most people don't even notice.
Just one more. Is nuclear a part of that future in terms of the renewable portfolio?
Maybe.
Oh, okay. That's definitive.
They're probably not big nuclear, but there are ideas for these much smaller nuclear plants that essentially come with the fuel in them and can be delivered by train to a place and just sort of like plug and play nuclear power plants. So there are a lot of people who are against nuclear for very clear reasons, and but that technology is always in play until we can get something better in place. It's still there, and like a lot of coal power plants, a lot of our current fleet of nuclear power plants will be aging out by 2035. We're going to have to just shut them down.
Yeah, we've had that in our region, and we've had to decommission a number. I can't thank you enough, Dr. Gretchen Bakke. The Grid is the book, The Fraying Wires Between Americans and Our Energy Future. A wonderful discussion today. Thank you for being on America Trends Podcast.
Thank you. It's my pleasure.
If you like this episode of America Trends Podcast, will you please leave us a kind rating or a review on iTunes? John, is that too much to ask?
No, or even a comment. Give
Anything.
us in the comments section on the ones that you liked. And, you can also email me at newsletter@rifkinradio.com. And that's another way you can contact us with your ideas.
Don't forget, your review really is important to us. And, John, they may say, why? Why? Why is it so important? Well, the more
why? Tell us.
You're even asking that.
Why?
Well, the more you like us, the better placement we get, which then helps us improve our rankings and visibility so that more people can enjoy us. And the more people, John, you see how this is spiraling?
It's getting out of control there.
The more people who know about us and like our content, the greater chance we have to encourage advertisers to hop aboard. You see how it works now, John?
I understand now. That's very interesting.
And we don't want these folks who are listening to miss a single episode of America Trends Podcast. I mean, we're recording tons of them, aren't we?
No, and they're all very interesting, and we got some really good stuff coming up.
Oh, we really do. But we want you to subscribe on iTunes or Stitcher.com. And when you do subscribe, let us know on Facebook and Twitter. Our handle on both platforms is @TrendsPodcast. We want to thank you personally for subscribing. In fact, John may have a very beautiful thank you gift. John, what is it? No? We ran out of them?
All out of gifts.
Oh, my goodness. Well,
sorry
please,
about that.
Please send us your ideas and questions for future episodes and topics on America Trends Podcast. We can't think of them all, right, John?
That's right.
I mean, my head's already exploding.
Oh, yes.
You see it.
I
Cloud
see it.
above. Is there an author you'd love to hear from? Or a subject you'd like to learn more about? Send us your ideas on Facebook and Twitter. You can direct message us at Trends Podcast or use hashtag Trends Podcast. You can also add an email address if you have one that you want to give out, and we do not, right, John? We don't share our lists.
No spamming, no list getting out. You just get our newsletter.
Absolutely. And you can access our full show archive on our website at americatrendspodcast.com. For more information on America Trends and for the latest updates on our upcoming episodes, be sure to like our page on Facebook and follow us on Twitter. You can find us at Trends Podcast. Oh, by the way, and John, this is really important, and you know
What is it? What is it?
Well, if you buy from Amazon, we have joined their Associates program. So you go to americatrendspodcast.com before you purchase, and you click over to Amazon from our Amazon store.
That's a very good point, because it doesn't cost them any more money to do that.
No, that's all built in.
And then we get a few pesos.
Yeah,
it helps
but
keep
and
the
look,
podcast going.
You know, if we get a small VIG, 2 or 3%, if you don't do it through us, you're just giving more money to Jeff Bezos.
Exactly.
And he doesn't need any more money.
He doesn't need it.
And he
That's
doesn't do
correct.
any podcasts, I don't think. So please, with no added cost to you, it helps us to bring you the content that you're enjoying. And thanks.
Thanks, everybody.
Please keep listening.